Tuesday edition. It is Orange Blue today. Cecil, Lammy, Andrew Mason talking about Pat Surtain leading the NFL's best defense in 2025. And Mace, you got to catch up with Surtain.
Yeah, he had one of his charity events Monday night. He spoke before that, and it's always good to see these guys out in the community. And right now, of course, they're in town for OTA, so there are a lot of community events going on. That's why, even though Von Miller's not with the Broncos, he had a community event last week. It's why you've got Cortland Sutton and a bunch of players that are going to do a community event down at Coors Field on Thursday night. But it's a big time of year for things coming together. And of course, Pat Surtain, Defensive Player of the Year, a core part of this defense. You just said, though, best defense in the league. You really think this is the best defense in the league?
Well, let's talk about it, because on paper, the additions that they've made have been simply fantastic. And I think top 5 is almost a given. Again, on paper, comparatively speaking to where they were last year, and then you add the strengths of Dre Greenlaw and Talanoa Hufanga. We talked about it on yesterday's show. And with a healthy Riley Moss, I think this team could have the best defense in the league. I don't think they need to, Mace. And even though Vance Joseph's on the hot seat, I don't think it needs to be number 1 or he's in trouble. I just think that top 5 expectation is already there with a chance to be number 1.
Okay, so, they were, for much of the season, a top 5 caliber defense, no doubt, last year. Down the stretch, obviously, they weren't. Now, that's kind of the key thing there. Now, they ended the season in terms of yards per play allowed, Cease. They actually did end the season number 2 in the league, despite what happened there in December. Of course, they had what happened in December, and then they got a little bit of it back against the Kansas City backups. So by one measure, they still ended up right there, top 5 yards per play. Yards per play allowed. Total defense, they were 7th. And then you can go deeper into things. You can go deeper into DVOA, things like that. To me, if they're not top 5 pretty much across the board, that's something that would be a disappointment unless you're talking about extenuating circumstances such as injuries. I think if you play, say, half the season without Pat Surtain, half the season without Zach Allen, those are what I would consider extenuating circumstances. And then, of course, the expectations do change. But if you have a season with relatively normal health, relatively normal injury luck, I'm not even saying good luck. The Broncos have been very fortunate in the last couple of years by and large. If it's normal, if it's somewhere in the middle of that curve, I think a fair expectation with where you are personnel wise is a top 5 defense.
Yes. Yeah. Top 5 defense is where it's at. And I believe last year it was those injuries. We often talk about the Riley Moss injury just being a bridge too far. You've got better depth now. When Chris Abrams-Draine is your 5th corner, that means you've got some depth now, because that's a young player that's got some good talent. But he's pushed down with the selection of Jahdae Barron. So injuries are going to happen. You want to stay healthy, but you want to play that complete season. And the last 2 years, Mace, it seems like they've had start of the year was bad, end of the year finished strong, and then last year, start of the year was strong, and then end of the year they finished poorly.
In both cases, personnel/injury issues played a role. Now, in the start of the 2023 season, remember, they played a few games there without Justin Simmons. That Washington game, he's playing injured, and then he's out in Miami. And of course, that's also Josie Jewell was injured. So you're playing that game without Simmons, without Jewell, and it's a mess, right? You had to play a lot of that game with Delarian Turner-Yell at safety, with Drew Sanders at linebacker, and neither one of them were ready for the task. And the Dolphins attacked the middle of that defense at the back 2 levels, and it was pretty bad.
Game over.
Pretty bad.
Yeah.
Shouldn't have been 70 points bad, but it was pretty bad.
Yeah. Yeah.
Shouldn't have been historically bad. Shouldn't have been more points allowed than than any game since 1966. I mean, that unfathomable, but I digress. I
Yeah.
don't want to have people flashing back to a very bad day.
Well, let's flash forward to the
Yeah.
schedule for this Broncos defense, because we talk about the offense doing things and Bo Nix
Yeah.
getting better, and we're going to continue that conversation. But I look at early games, Cincinnati, the Chargers are going to provide their own sort of test. The Bengals, the Eagles, those 3 games in a row, Mace, and that's all within 5 weeks of the start of the year. First 2, Tennessee, rookie quarterback, and then Indianapolis, who knows the quarterback, but like Chargers, Bengals, Eagles, by week 5, you'll be tested about how good this defense actually is.
Well, the Colts provide a very specific test, maybe not so much to Pat Surtain. We'll get into a couple of the sound bites from him later in the show. They provide a very specific test to the run defense because that area was gashed last December.
Yes.
The Colts gashed it. The Chargers and Bengals had their success against it. And then certainly Buffalo had hit its way with the Broncos on the ground. And that's the thing. I mean, we talk about Riley Moss and what the Broncos lost when he got injured. Certainly we can flash back to the Browns game and Jerry Jeudy having his way against Levi Wallace in particular. But it also was the run defense too. It was, and everything works together because corners provide run support. It's all interconnected. It's
pass rushers help your secondary.
Yes, it's like the rainforest. It's like the ecosystem. Everything's connected to some degree.
Yeah.
So it all came apart just as everything had worked together so well in those first 3 months of the season. And that's why, even though, you wouldn't think of Riley Moss playing a key role in run defense, it did play a role in some of the things that did go wrong down the stretch against the run. And that's why I do say, yeah, it was the injury that kind of proved to be the bridge too far, because you had already lost Alex Singleton, and you were trying to figure things out at inside linebacker. I mean, eventually they did settle on Justin Sternad playing next to Cody Barton. But remember, I mean, they took a look at, Zach Cunningham for a while, right? I mean, they were bringing, it was, let's see this veteran here. Let's see if this guy can do it. And then eventually it was back to Sternad. So that's something to be mindful of looking back as well. So week 2 is a test in and of itself. Yes, the big tests do start in week 3, but week 2 is a specific kind of test. And I think we do start getting the answers then in Indianapolis. If they shut down Jonathan Taylor, if they keep him corralled, then I think we start getting the signs that, okay, it's back to where it was in those first 3 months of last season. It's back to that top 5 type of unit that I think led to us even last year talking about, okay, is Vance Joseph going to get his head coaching look this coming off season? It didn't happen then, but gets back to that level. And maybe you see the step beyond taken in those next 3 games, Chargers, Bengals, Eagles, that being what really proves where this defense is. And if you see the results, then I think, you've got something that maybe you can get to a Super Bowl with.
You've got something that can get you far in the postseason, and the depth is better because starters from last year are now part of the depth, and there's new starters aboard. Something that Surtain, when you were able to catch up with him yesterday, he had something to say about these new additions, Mace. I think we're all excited about seeing Dre Greenlaw, Talanoa Hufanga, and others out there.
No doubt about it. Here's what he had to say.
It's great additions to our team and towards our success. Obviously, with Dre and Hufanga, them guys gonna get after it. I mean, they've been in Super Bowls before. They know how to win at a high level. So, adding those guys to the team, it just looks sharper on the horizon. So I'm looking forward to stepping on the field with them.
Knowing how to win at high levels, and I think that's something that's sort of key there as well in terms of bringing them in, is having guys who've kind of played on that big stage, or at least have been a part of a team that's been on that big stage, because that is something where you have a Broncos team that has that taste of the playoffs, but they don't necessarily know what they don't know what it takes yet to win. Like they understand like how it's a level jump, but they're still kind of learning all that needs to be done to succeed. We tend to see a lot more of this in the NBA in terms of how contenders evolve. Like there's always like that you have that first round playoff loss, and then you go a little deeper, and then down the line comes your title run. Like you kind of pay your dues a little bit. Like last year was sort of like the first of the Broncos kind of dues paying moments, but there's not a lot of guys in that locker room that really know what it's like to succeed in January, quite frankly. And with Hufanga and Greenlaw, they come from a culture that does know that type of success. Now they come to a coaching staff that's led by a head coach who knows how to do that. He's trying to teach his guys that, but teaching can only go so far. The playing experience is kind of where is the best teacher. And sometimes the best teachers of that, in addition to experience, are players who've actually been through that, rather than a coach standing there at the front of a meeting room saying, this is what it's like. Sometimes those lessons are better coming from guys like Greenlaw and Hufanga than a coach standing up there at the lectern.
Yeah, in NBA terms, they call it scars. Like who's got the scars, the battle scars from those playoff triumphs and tragedies and all that. Well, you heard Surtain say it. These guys have gotten to the Super Bowl. Now it's time for them to teach these other guys how to get there. And then the second part of that is to win the damn thing.
Well, certainly Greenlaw's got a scar from the Super Bowl because, of course, that's where he had that Achilles injury.
Right.
Back in the Super Bowl against the Chiefs. So, I mean, he's really been through it to some degree. And, of course, now he's not out there for OTAs, but he'll be out there for training camp as well. So, this of course, is another thing with Greenlaw and Hufanga. Like they've been through it in multiple ways. They've been through postseason successes, but they've also been through the loss in the ultimate game. And then they've also been through injuries. And it's something that we always have to bring up. Injuries are the reason why they're here. If they had stayed healthy, they would probably still be 49ers somehow, some way at this point. And that is the risk that you're running. And for all we talk about here with them and what you expect them to bring, there is that risk here with them. And it's the one thing that could go awry, is if they're not as far back as you expect them to be coming from injuries. It's the one thing you have to be mindful of. And I think with Hufanga in particular, because we saw him last year and he wasn't all the way back. What we want to see as you get into training camp and you get to full speed and get the pads on is, okay, does he start to look closer to what he was back a couple of years ago, when he was that guided missile before, and he didn't look that way last year? Does he start looking closer to that? If he does, then you've got exceptional value on that contract. You've got a player who's an absolute stud. If he doesn't, then what's kind of your plan to kind of, to help get him back? Like, do you maybe have to watch his workload a little bit, perhaps? Do you have to kind of continue, work him rehab wise to make sure you can, get him all the way back? Like what's the plan there? Because you want to maximize him to say, okay, how do we get you looking the way you did before, not the way you looked last year? Because unfortunately, I mean, he did look pretty pedestrian when he came back last year. That's why he was available. The roll of the dice here is on trying to get him to look the way he did 2 years ago.
Yeah, and I love the rainforest conversation, Mase, because it's all interconnected. And when this team's weak against the run, well, your corners aren't going to get a chance to make plays on the ball because you don't need to pass the ball. I've often joked, like, Josh Allen didn't even have to do anything except hand off to James Cook in the postseason. So Greenlaw, Talanoa Hufanga, they both help the run defense. Now, if you're a quarterback, you may have to go through the air. a little bit more, and that's where Surtain can come in and make plays. That's where Nick Benito becomes more of a factor. Jonathan Cooper, your pass rushers there as well. So it's a catch-22 for an opponent against this team, and it makes you wonder, because Surtain talked about it, and I'm not exactly sure the answer, Mace. I'm not exactly sure his answer was actually an answer, but like, how can PS2 get better? My opinion on that is just more opportunity, and that opportunity comes from the defense being really sound against the run.
Well, let's hear what Pat Surtain had to say to that, and then we'll dive in a little bit.
I still feel like I could always get better in my game. Just even my leadership role, being able to impact players around me, as much as I can, and just honing in on the little intricate things that I could work on, the little details that I know that could definitely refine my game.
It's ironic that he talked about details there because that was a very nonspecific answer. And it's the kind of nonspecific answer you give when you don't really know how you can get better, right? I mean, he talked about leadership, but leadership is sort of that kind of hazy thing. Look, we've said it on the show throughout the offseason. Where do you go from up? Where do you go from literally the best defensive player in the game? That's what the trophy is, basically. DPOY, Defensive Player of the Year. It says you are the best in the sport. I mean, the cliche, you can only go down from there.
Right.
That's the problem. And we've talked about this with the defense at large. The pass rush, you just set a franchise record in sacks. You led the league in sacks. Where do you go from there? It's one concern that you have, kind of statistically speaking, because regression is sometimes inevitable from that. And so what you're hoping is maybe if there is some regression, that you have a sanction in other areas, and things end up kind of balancing out, and maybe you get a sanction on the offense from Bo Nix taking some steps in his second year and everything works out. And on the whole, you end up a better team, even though some things take a slight step back because of a natural regression. That's, and that's okay. You're focused on being a better overall team, even though some things kind of fall back a little bit, and that's fine.
Yeah.
That's okay.
It's natural.
But for Pat Surtain, it's okay. How do you get the ball in his direction more? How do you get quarterbacks to look in his direction more? Long term, that's where, if Jahdae Barron ends up being that guy that you hope he can be, that's where hopefully the ball goes in Surtain's direction more, because Barron ends up being a lockdown guy. But that's something that develops over time. Can Riley Moss take a step up and be more of a lockdown player in his second year as a starter? That's something you're hoping for. Just improvement in coverage in other areas. Can Hufanga be, more of the first responder at that position than you had last year? Can he take away a little more of the field? Again, forcing quarterbacks to look more in PS2's direction, get the ball in that direction, set up more opportunities for him. That's part of the equation you're hoping for, to just get him some more opportunities to make more plays on the ball and have a chance to have that kind of impact that you're hoping he can have beyond just simply being locked down. That's so it's all interconnected, right? And you mentioned the run defense. If you're shutting down the run, you're setting up those opportunities. To kind of distill it down to the Buffalo games, for example. Remember, against Buffalo in 2023, Broncos forced the early fumble, and Ken Dorsey, in a play calling experience that ends up getting him fired the next day, goes away from James Cook, goes away from the run. He shouldn't have done that. Doesn't go back to the run until the fourth quarter. And of course, the Bills start trampling the Broncos on the ground when they go back to the run.
Right.
Ends up not being enough to get Buffalo the win. They come back, they take the lead, but Denver gets the win at the last gasp. Penalty certainly helps. Happy night for the Denver Broncos. But based on the game flow, I think we can all agree that if Ken Dorsey had not abandoned the run, then Buffalo probably would have won that game, given how they were working against the Broncos. So certainly Buffalo has got something figured out against Vance Joseph's defense on the ground. So what you kind of learn from that is you still have to stop the run first. It's an old school mentality, but even against a team that's got an elite quarterback like Josh Allen, you have to stop the run and set up the pass, force them to throw. The Broncos want to force teams to throw the ball. And yes, that includes teams that have Joe Burrow at quarterback, Patrick Mahomes at quarterback, Jalen Hurts at quarterback, Jaden Daniels at quarterback. These elite passers that you're going to see this year that have beaten teams with their arms and with those elite targets that you're going to see in those games, you still want to force them to throw. You want to force them to be one-dimensional, because even if that dimension can be elite, if they are distilled down to one dimension, you are forcing them into a strength, what you believe is going to be a strength of the Denver Broncos, which is a secondary that, as you've constructed it, as you've built it, you've invested in it. You've invested draft capital in Barron and Surtain, who's now your DPOY. You've invested free agent capital in Hufanga. You've invested size speed capital in Riley Moss, a third-round pick who is blossoming, and knock on every surface you can find, he can stay healthy. You want teams to throw at you and test that, because if they do, over the long haul, you ought to like your chances if they go right at that unit.
I'd like our chances of growing our YouTube channel, but Mase, how can folks help us do that?
Like,
comment,
share,
subscribe,
hit that notification bell,
so that you
never miss
a vid.
vid.
That's right. He's Andrew Mason. You follow him on all the socials at Mase Denver. I'm at Cecil and Mase saying OBT's a BFD. Thank you very much for watching. Stay tuned, and would you please stay frosty